Okay, so to end chapter 8, we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between perfectly competitive firms in the short run and in the long run. We've already talked a lot about the short run. A firm's short run supply curve in a perfectly competitive market looks like this. Uh, the supply curve, if you think back to chapter 2, shows the quantity supplied at each price. Individual firms will choose to produce where price equals marginal cost, and the short run supply curve is equal to equal to the short run marginal cost curve. But there's one thing to note here. Only a portion of the short run marginal cost curve above the average variable cost curve will be this firm supply curve. Why is that? Think back to the previous video. The firm won't produce if price is less than average variable cost. So this is what our situation looks like normally when we're thinking about an individual firm. We have the marginal cost curve going through the minimum of the average variable cost curve and through the minimum of the average total cost curve. And the firm won't produce below this level, right? So at this point and above, the firm will produce, and below, it won't produce. That just means that the firm's short-run supply curve will only be the portion of the marginal cost curve above the average variable cost. That's the only part of the curve that the firm will supply to. Everything below, it's not enough to cover the price isn't enough to cover their average variable costs, and so they don't produce. Because they don't produce, it isn't part of their supply curve. We also want to talk briefly about producer surplus. Producer surplus is kind of related to profit, but they're not the same thing. Producer surplus is always the total revenue minus the variable cost. Profit, meanwhile, is the total revenue minus the variable costs minus the fixed costs. So if you substitute in this equation for producer surplus into this total revenue minus variable costs, profit then is just equal to the producer surplus minus the fixed costs. In other words, firms will operate without making a profit, but in the long run, they'll shut down if they're not making any producer surplus. This is a figure it out problem number 3 that I go through in the figure it out problem number 3 video. This is the pop-up question. I posted the pop-up question slides on Canvas, but if you haven't looked at those, you can copy it down here. So we have been talking about the short run. Let's switch perspectives to the long run. The long run's different from the short run in a number of ways. The first one is that we talked a lot about how in the short run some costs are fixed. We have these fixed costs that can't be adjusted. Now, in the long run, everything can be adjusted. So there is no fixed cost in the long run. Everything is variable. Also, in the long run, firms can enter and exit freely in response to market conditions. So if they're making a negative profit in the long run, they'll choose to leave. And if firms that don't exist yet see that firms in the market are making a positive profit, they can enter. The third thing is that the short run supply curve is the portion of the short run marginal cost curve above the short run average variable cost curve. That's just what I showed you a couple slides ago. It's that area above the average variable cost. That's the firm's individual supply curve. However, in the long run, firms won't stay in business unless all costs can be covered by revenue. Therefore, the long run supply curve is the portion of the marginal cost curve above the average total cost curve. In the short run, we said that the firm's supply curve was everything above the average variable cost curve. Now, in the long run, the only part that's the supply curve is the area of the marginal cost curve above the average total cost curve. Also, I sort of alluded to it when I was talking about point 2. But if there are positive economic profits, new firms will enter. When new firms enter, the market supply curve shifts outward. This makes sense. We're just increasing the supply of firms in the long run when new firms enter. On the opposite side of the spectrum, exit causes the industry supply curves to shift inward. Again, there are just fewer firms. Because there are fewer firms, there's less product being made, so the supply curve shifts to the left. And firms will exit until the market price equals the minimum of the long run average total cost curve. That's just reflective of 0.3 there. It's also worth noting that even in perfect competition, you can have a situation where different firms have different costs. Some firms are more efficient at production than other firms are. In the long run, there's no potential for economic profit in a perfectly competitive industry. This is the assumption when the firms have identical cost curves. However, some firms are more efficient than others. These more efficient firms earn economic rent or returns to specialized inputs above what firms paid them for them. This is just reflective of the fact that some firms, even in a perfectly competitive industry, in the long run can earn positive profits because they're so efficient at production and they are specialized to the point that they are able to extract more than what they paid for them. In a perfectly competitive market consisting of firms with different long-run average cost curves, the long-run market price equals the minimum average total cost of the highest cost firm in the industry. I know that one's kind of a mouthful. Also, the highest cost firm makes zero profit and zero producer surplus. All that means is that when you think about the average total cost curve and the marginal cost curve for the entire industry, the market price is the minimum of the average total cost curve. That's the point where the least efficient firm is operating. That least efficient firm is making zero profit, but it's still producing. Everyone above that firm on the supply curve could be making positive economic profit because they are more efficient at producing than that minimum point. There are also adjustments that happen to the equilibrium in the long run. The first case could be an increase in demand. This is just simple demand curve shifts. You've seen these probably a million times between both micro and macro. So imagine that for some reason the demand for something increases. The firms that are already in the market enjoy positive economic profits because the price is greater than their long-run average total cost. However, new firms keep entering because they see that there's profit to be had, and so the supply curve also shifts. The supply curve shifts to the right, price falls, and there's a new minimum long-run average total cost. The next slide will demonstrate these ideas graphically. On the opposite end of the spectrum, it could also be that there's an increase in production costs. If there's an increase in production costs, for some reason, some input becomes more expensive. Say the government starts tariffing input goods from China. Some firms won't be able to handle the increased costs of those inputs when they're making whatever they're making, and so they end up experiencing negative economic profits in the short run. Maybe that they can't cover those costs in the long run, and so they end up exiting the market. This shifts the supply curve to the right. The market price increases until that market price is equal to the long run average total cost. Graphically, what does this look like? On the left-hand side, we have the industry supply curve and the industry demand curve. On the right-hand side, we have the demand and supply curves for an individual firm. So imagine like in the first case, there's a taste change, and so the demand curve shifts to the right because demand for a product is increased. On the right-hand side, we have still P1. The long-run marginal cost is going through the long-run average total cost. But imagine that this demand shifts so that quantity is equal to Q2. In the long run, that will shift up the price. Firms will enter. There's a new supply curve. Because there's a new supply curve, there's a new equilibrium point, and point it out here. So firms enter when they see that there's more profit to be made. Because more firms enter, this shifts the supply curve now to the right. Now we have this equilibrium point back at Q2 and P1. So we started off at P1. For a short period, we moved up here as demand changed. But as soon as firms saw that there was positive economic profit being made among the individual firms, new firms enter. S1 becomes, supply curve 1 becomes supply curve 2. We get back to this new equilibrium with a higher quantity, but the same price as originally. Again now, we move back down the marginal cost curve back down to P1, and there's zero profit being made. This is the long run equilibrium in this case. You start off at a certain price, demand increases, profits increase. Once profit increases, outside firms enter to try to capture some of that profit. Because they enter, quantity increases, prices start to decrease again until we get back down to that original price where nobody is making any profit. And with that, we come to the end of Chapter 8. Going forward, we'll move from the perfectly competitive case to, I believe, the monopoly case. So we've looked at the case now with a lot of firms. Next, we're going to shift to the case with just one firm in the market.